Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our third and final keynote lecture. Today, we have with us Tim Haughton, who is an associate professor of European politics at the University of Birmingham. His research interests encompass elections, parties, and domestic politics in post-communist Central Europe, specifically Slovakia, Slovenia, and the Czech Republic. Tim Haughton is the author of Constraints and Opportunities of Leadership in Post-Communist Europe and the co-author of The New Party Challenge, Changing Cycles of Party Birth and Death in Central Europe and Beyond. He is also a former co-editor of Journal of Common Market Studies Annual Review of the European Union. Today's lecture deals with the legacy of Czechoslovak communism and is titled Longer, Darker, and Different Than Expected, Assessing Communism's Shadow of Czech and Slovak Politics since 1989. So, Mr. Haughton, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. I've mentioned this already to the interpreters. I know that this is taking place in both English and Czech. And although I will speak in English, I just want to say a couple of sentences in Czech at the beginning. So, i když budu mluvit mateřským jazykem, to znamená angličtinou, na začátku já bych chtěl poděkovat organizátorům konferenci za pozvání a za příležitost říct pár slov o vývoji politiky po revoluci. Škoda samozřejmě leží v tom, že nejsme spolu v Praze a nemáme příležitost, abychom pokračovali diskusí v hospodách v Praze. So that's me murdering the beautiful Czech language. I will return now to my mother tongue. But I just wanted to start off by thanking very much Matěj Bilý and the conference organizing committee for inviting me to talk to you today. Now I know that it's Friday afternoon. Czechs and Slovaks would be normally thinking about the trip to the chata or the chalupa. I know in a time of pandemic that is not so easy to do. And I know that we're towards the end of a conference and no doubt a few of you already feel a little bit zoomed out. But what I want to try to do is to give you some insights, some reflections on developments in politics in the Czech and Slovak Republic since 1989, and to try to make the presentation as interesting and informative as possible. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank a few other people, not just the wonderful organizers of this fantastic conference, but I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank my frequent co-author, Kevin Deegan-Krause. The book, which Matěj was kind enough to mention in his introduction, The New Party Challenge, I will use some of the findings of that book in the final third of my remarks today. But also, as I was putting together this presentation, it reminded me how much I'm grateful to a number of wonderful friends and co-authors over the years, people like Darina Malova or Sharon Fisher, Marek Rybaš, Vlastimil Havlík, and many more that have helped me understand better the developments of Czech and Slovak politics since 1989. Now, all good British academics, to conform to cultural stereotype, probably begin their presentations with an apology. And I want to just make a couple of remarks in terms of an apology to you. So firstly, I know that this is primarily a conference of historians. I am a political scientist, not a wonderful historian. I am, though, of that group of political scientists that believe very strongly that you cannot understand politics without understanding history. The tree of political science has historical roots, and to understand political phenomena, we need to understand history as well as contemporary politics. Secondly, I've done more work over the years on the case of Slovakia than the Czech Republic, so I will probably say a little bit more about the Slovak case than the Czech case. And finally, although I'll offer some broader reflections on politics, I'm going to focus mostly on party politics, perhaps for a conference which is focusing on the 100th anniversary of the Czechoslovak Communist Party. That's not an inappropriate focus, but I wanted to focus really on party politics and looking at the developments of party politics since 1989. Now, I want to make 4 arguments to you in the course of the next 25 minutes or so. The first main argument that I want to make to you is that time and timings matter. Lech Wałęsa once famously said, "How you see things depends on where you sit." I would also argue very strongly, how you see things depends on when you actually look back. And I'm going to make a couple of points about how the time at which we look back may affect our judgment as to the legacies and of the communist period. Secondly, I want to emphasize the importance of contingency and choice in explaining the developments of party politics in both the Czech and the Slovak republics since 1989. Thirdly, in the case of Slovakia, one argument that I'm going to make, and I have made before in print, is that actually the federal and the post-federal experience of Slovakia is very important. It really matters a lot in explaining the politics, particularly of 1990s Slovakia. And in some respects, perhaps it's that federal and post-federal experience which perhaps matters more than the communist or even the post-communist experience in the 20th century. And the final main argument I want to make is that we are seeing the changing dimensions of party politics in the 21st century, the salience of appeals linked to newness, to anti-corruption, and to celebrity. Okay, what about this first point that I want to make about time and timings when we look and make judgments and how that affects how we look at things? We look back at different points in time. This is a presentation as part of a conference looking back 100 years. The effects, that point at which we look back affects our perceptions of what has happened. But it also changes our views of events and people. People that we may have judged in a particular way at a particular point in time, these may be affected, our judgments of what they did then may well be affected by what has happened subsequently. So here is some pictures of a politician that is well known to all of you in this audience, Miloš Zeman. And I would suggest to you that if we reflect back on him and his contribution to Czech politics, we would have a very different view if we reflected on 89, if we reflected in 2002, looking back then at 1989, or if we look back today, back at 2002, the end of his time as Czech Prime Minister, or his role and giving speeches and the like, and his role as a member of the Prognostic Institute back in 1989. If we then take the perspective of 1989, 1990, how things were expected to turn out at that particular point, I don't need to explain to an audience of historians about the 40 years of communism in Czechoslovakia. This was a political system which aimed at a total transformation of Czechoslovak society. The tentacles of the communist regime stretched into every aspect of Czech and Slovak life. And from the perspective of 1989, 1990, we may well have expected the shadow of communism to be very long and very dark. And certainly that was the view taken by both people on the communist side and the non-communist side in 1989, 1990. Now, of course, the kinds of choices that needed to be made in 1989, 1990 about democratization, about marketization, those big questions of transformation, there was also another very important question, which is how you go about dealing with the past. And in the case of Czechoslovakia, the process of lustration, dealing with those people who collaborated with the security services, was a very important issue, a very politically hot topic in those early years. But what's interesting is reflect on, move the clock on to 2021. How important are those kinds of connections, those roles? Who did what to whom back in the communist times? I don't need to explain to this particular audiences that questions over Prime Minister Babiš and what he may or may not have done back in the 1980s may be interesting questions, but arguably other factors matter significantly more in 2021 about the use of European funds or general issues to do with corruption, or indeed how well or badly a government is dealing with the pandemic. Now, in terms of Communism Shadow, an excellent book by Grigor Pop-Eliches and Josh Tucker, and a recent article that they published in Comparative Political Studies, sought to distinguish between what they called living through communism and living through post-communism. And the upshot of their book was to argue that living through communism had a greater impact on the attitude of citizens across Central and Eastern Europe than living through post-communism. They argued that we can see a significant leftist bias in attitudes, but they suggest that this, what they called this leftist surplus across the region, was largely limited to those people with low levels of support for democracy. Amongst the pro-democratic post-communist citizens, they suggested the post-communist left-wing bias disappears. They suggest, though, that there was a significant left authoritarianism leaving a communist legacy. And there's a long quote I know I have here on the slide, but they argue that the respondents who had been exposed to this full dose of East European communism of 4 decades and more were more likely, more than twice as likely, to express that left authoritarian values as their non-communist counterparts, and more than 3 times more likely than their compatriots who came of age after the fall of communism. In other words, one of the arguments they were making in the book is a kind of generational or a cohort effect. This cohort effect was also discussed in an excellent article by Lukáš Linek, published back in 2008, in which he was asking the question, when will the voters for KSČ, the Communist Successor Party in the Czech case, when they would die off? And what's interesting, actually, if you look at his article and his modeling, he was suggesting that by about this point, that KSČ would be receiving about 5, 6, or 7% of the vote, depending on turnout. We can actually see the development of support for KSČ has actually followed Lukáš's predictions to a greater or lesser extent. Now, if we focus in on party politics, the Czech and Slovak stories are noticeably different. Out of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, on the Czech side, we saw the emergence of the Communist Party of Bohemia and Moravia, KSČ. But on the Slovak side, we've seen significant churn and developments. So we saw the emergence of the Party of the Democratic Left, SDL. We also saw the continuation of a hardline communist party, KSS. But we also saw some splinters and breakaways from SDL. So the SDR in 2002. We also saw the breakaway of Smer in 1999, 2000, and more recently, the party Hlas breaking away from Smer. In fact, in the Slovak case, we can even suggest that the most popular party today in Slovakia is the successor of the Communist Successor Party. So there's a kind of long line in the Slovak case, whereas in the Czech case, we see significant continuity. This is the map of the Czech party system since 1989. And without going into enormous detail here, one of the things that I will just want to flag up here is that if you look at the middle third of this map of the party system, you can see that Czech party politics was really dominated by four parties for a long period of time. The Civic Democratic Party, the Christian Democrats, the Czech Social Democratic Party, and the Communist Successor Party, KSČ. And really, our understanding or our reflections on Czech party politics is affected by when we look. If I were giving this lecture 15 years ago, I'd be talking about the stability of Czech party politics. Reflecting on Czech party politics today, I'd be more likely to refer to the instability and the churn and the change of party politics. But one constant of party politics pretty much has been KSČ. Its support has waxed and waned, but it has been a perennial on the party scene of the Czech Republic. But just to flesh out the kinds of transformation of Czech politics, it's striking that if we take KSČ and the Social Democrats, in recent polls, they would only amount to 10% of the voter support. If we take KSČ and ČSSD and add in two parties that are two of those perennial parties now part of a broader electoral coalition, that still amounts to only to less than a third of support in the Czech Republic. And that's very striking because if we go back to 2006, those four perennial parties were winning 87% of the vote. The Slovak party system is different, and the development is different, as the party map here shows quite well. Slovak party politics, as I've argued very strongly, have been stable in their instability, where we've seen new parties emerge at virtually every election. But crucially, notice that big block of brown on the left-hand side, HZDS. This is a party that I will refer back to in a moment. But in terms of the Communist Party and the successors of the Communist Party, we can see, in contrast to the Czech case, it's a more complex situation with several fissions and fusions since 1989. And in the Slovak case, if we were to transport someone from early 1990s politics back to Slovakia today, they would only recognize one party that currently, according to opinion polls, would get into parliament. But they may even be surprised to know that that one party, the Christian Democratic Movement, isn't currently in the Slovak parliament. So going back to this theme I said before about reflections at particular points in time. So I reflected initially on the position in 1989, 1990. So let's fast forward from that 10 years and reflect back on where we were at 10 years after the fall of communism. Well, there is a lot of scholarship produced on communist successor parties after the decade. A terrific book by Anna Křimová-Busa, other articles by scholars like Mitchell Orenstein and others. In essence, what they sought to explain was the variation in the levels of success across the four Visegrad communist successor parties. And the striking thing reflecting after 10 years was the success of the Hungarian Socialist Party and the Democratic Left Alliance in Poland, the limited success of SDL in Slovakia, and the much more limited success of KSČ in the Czech Republic. And what Anna Křimová-Busa in particular in her book argued was that this was a product of the fact that the communist parties in Hungary and in Poland were led out of the communist period by reformists. These reformists had what she called portable skills and usable pasts, that they were then able to use those skills, use those pasts effectively to build modern progressive center-left parties in the Hungarian and the Polish cases. Of course, what they argued is in the case of KSČ, the fact that this party did not transform itself in the same way that the Polish and the Hungarian cases. In fact, it's a party that, of course, kept the word communist in its name, gone through different leaders. There has been battles between more reformist and more hardline figures within that party. But essentially, this is a party that has still remained or a party that still talks in positive terms about some of the pre-89 experiences, and certainly doesn't distance itself away from its communist past. This is the story of Czech party politics in the first decade. You can see that the real support on the left went to the Czech Social Democratic Party in that first decade. The story of the Slovak case is a little bit more complicated, and this is where the arguments made by Anna Křimová-Busa and others I would challenge a little bit. What's striking in the Slovak case is, like the Polish and the Hungarian cases, reformists came to the fore. Politicians like Petr Weiss and Pavel Kanis, for example, were instrumental in trying to move the Slovak Communist Party, transforming it into the party of the democratic left, and seeking to try and follow that Polish and the Hungarian cases in terms of the type of party it was creating. But SDL proved to be a party that wasn't as successful as the Polish and the Hungarian cases. And here it comes into the second big argument that I was making about the importance of choices, about strategic choices. I would argue that the leadership of SDL made a number of significant mistakes, or certainly the consequences of their choices affected their popularity. So their decision in 1994, for example, to push for early elections, thinking that they could replicate the success of the Polish and the Hungarian cases, hit them hard in the elections in the autumn. Their decision to form an electoral coalition, the Common Choice Coalition, I would argue was a mistake. The movement towards more progressive, more center-left politics led to a breakaway party under Jan Lupták, but also during the 1998-2002 period, when they came back into government, the policies pursued by politicians like Brigita Šmrgnorová, who became the finance minister, although arguably necessary in order to get Slovakia back on track and moving towards EU membership. These are policies that hit traditional voters, or the traditional voter base of a centre-left party, pretty hard. There was also another important strategic error arguably made when the party came into government in 1998, and that was not to give Robert Fico a significant position, and he of course left and formed his own party not long afterwards. So the story of SDL is one of limited success. I've argued so far that choices, strategic decisions, were important in the fate of SDL. But I would also suggest that actually, to understand Slovak politics in the 1990s, it's really important to understand the federal, the post-federal, and the politics of independence in that country. One of the striking aspects is that many of those more traditional voters, those voters with that kind of attitude, those attitudes that Pop Elliches and Tucker talk about in their work, were attracted to support to the party, the movement of for a democratic Slovakia under the leadership of Vladimir Mečiar. Now, what's crucial is that Slovakia, coming to terms with its federal experience, also coming to terms with its deeper historical experiences. One could even argue that that what was more significant for 1990s politics was less 40 years of communism, and arguably the Treaty of Trianon that left significant proportion of ethnic Hungarians living on the territory of Slovakia. That mix of the federal experience, the coming to terms with the post-federal experience, the politics of independence, arguably ensured that the kind of the politics of Mečiar distorted, if you like, the left-right politics of Slovakia in the 1990s, and was crucial to the limited success of SDL in the 1990s. Fast forward 30 years, looking back after 30 years of from the revolution, what might we say then? Well, Anna Ximała-Busta, in an excellent chapter recently, reflected back on what she called the paradoxical fate of the communist successor parties. And what she was arguing quite strongly was that the same factors that allowed these parties to gain widespread electoral support, particularly the claim about management, about being expert managers, allow them to win elections and govern in the short term, led to their long-term demise. This is what she argues explains the failure or the drop in support for the Hungarian Socialist Party, and really the failure of the left in Poland in the early 2000s. Both of those failures, of course, crucially linked into the issue of corruption. This is the picture of the vote of the Czech left over the 3 decades. And what's very striking about that is the continuation of levels of support for KSČ. KSČ was a party which had an almost pariah status throughout these 3 decades, although crucially not always completely a pariah role. Václav Klaus smiling there, the pen snatcher in chief. Klaus smiling because it was thanks to KSČ that he became president. But also we could point out to the current government in the Czech Republic that Babiš is there in part thanks to votes or non-votes of the communists in parliament. And mentioning Babiš and his role in Czech politics reminds us that one of the kind of legacies of the communist period, or actually legacies of the early post-communist period, is less about what people who did what to whom, that kind of aspect of Babiš's past, but crucially that the early 1990s was a period pregnant with possibility in which politicians and businessmen were able to enrich themselves in a significant way. And of course, Babiš made a lot of, was very successful in those early 1990s and subsequently becoming a very rich and successful politician, and able then, a couple of decades later, to make a pitch to Czech voters to say, we're not like those ordinary politicians, we can get things done, as in that famous slogan of his. And Czech politics in the last decade has been characterized by several new parties that we've seen emerged, 4 of which I depict on this particular slide. And one of the things that Kevin and I have discovered in our book, which is very striking, is the way in which a lot of Czech voters, once they have voted for a new party at one election, they seem to develop this taste for newness at the next election, and even newer parties at subsequent elections. So what seems to be important in Czech politics, not just in Czech politics, is the appeal of newness. Newness often wrapped up with a celebrity or an anti-corruption appeal. This is not just the case in the Czech Republic. We see similar kinds of movements in Slovakia as well. Now, this is the position of Slovakia in 2020 in terms of the parliamentary vote. And one of the most striking aspects of that parliament, something I alluded to earlier, was actually how young so many of the parties are in Slovak politics. If we look at the parties in parliament in Slovakia, we can see that actually the grande dame of Slovak parliamentary politics is actually Smer, Robert Fico's party, which, as I said before, we could think of it as the successor to the communist successor party. It's the oldest party in the Slovak parliament at the moment. And this drive for kind of newness within Slovak politics is really striking. So not only have we seen a breakaway from Smer to create this party Hlas, which, as I said, you can probably think of now as the successor to the Communist Successor Party. But also we've seen other splits. We've seen a split in Kotleva's party to create a new party, Republika. We've also in recent times seen the merging together of the ethnic Hungarian parties that come together in this new party, Aliancia. As my frequent co-author Kevin Deegan-Krause remarked when he saw this picture, it reminds him of IKEA, and we may suggest that indeed they called for help, not to the IKEA helpline, but maybe to the Budapest helpline. So this process of newness, of creation of new parties, doesn't seem to be slowing down. It seems to be there in both the Czech and the Slovak cases. And indeed, there's a bigger point that we might want to reflect on about how party politics is organized and the key divisions of party politics in the 21st century in both the Czech and the Slovak cases. That we might suggest that in addition to the left-right socio-economic division of politics about the role that the state plays in the economy, in addition to that, and in addition to what the Chapel Hill survey called the Galtan dimension, or what we can call the kind of values dimension between a kind of liberal, open, progressive view of politics and a more traditional authoritarian national view of politics. We can argue perhaps that actually we need a third dimension of politics to understand the importance of this clean, corrupt dimension of politics, that we see new parties emerging, pointing out the corrupt politicians in power, setting up their new parties. The problem is a lot of those new parties then go on to demonstrate that they are just as corrupt as those that they claim are corrupt, creating space for yet more new parties. So you may ask yourself, isn't Tim kind of moving far away from the legacies of communism here? In some senses, yes, I am. I'm suggesting that in some respects, the key dynamics of party politics for much, in both the Czech and the Slovak cases, perhaps has less to do with communism, more to do with newness, to do with themes, to do with governability, and to do with corruption. But it's also kind of just worth reflecting a little bit on where we are and where we might reflect upon developments in the future. Looking back now, we're looking back 31 and a half years after the end of the communist period. Of course, the communist period in Czechoslovakia was 40 years. What will be very interesting, 41 years, maybe to reflect on developments in a few years' time, in 2030, when the same amount of time, there would have been the same amount of time since the 89 revolutions as Czechoslovakia experienced as a communist time. So here's an idea to Maciej and your colleagues, an idea for a conference in a few years' time to actually reflect on those 40 and those other 40 years of communism. But finally, what I want to say, as I realize I'm close to or just over my allotted time, is to say it's also just worth reflecting on the broader processes of democracy and democratization in both the Czech and Slovak republics. One of the more striking aspects of 1989-1990 is that the communists, maybe reluctantly, but accepted the transformation of Czech and Slovak society, have accepted the kind of basis of democracy in both two countries. What's really interesting to reflect on is that actually some of the challenges to democracy in the Visegrad Four, for example, come from politicians like Viktor Orbán, who were on the other side of the communist, anti-communist divide back in 1989. But democratization is not an event, it's a process. Democracy is a really, really hard job. Beautifully summed up, I think, in this cartoon of my favorite cartoonist, Shuti in Slovakia. Demokracia je makačka, democracy is a really difficult job. And on that note, I think I've slightly exceeded my 30 minutes, but I shall stop. So thank you very much. Děkuji moc krát. Děkujem velmi pěkně for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Professor Haughton. We have no questions on our YouTube chat, but well, let me remind to the audience that you are free to ask Tim Haughton anything. The chat is located on the right side of your screen, and still nothing. So let me ask the first questions. You focus mostly on Slovakia, the Slovakians, the SDL, but my first question goes back home to the Czech Republic and the Czech politics, if you don't mind. Do you think that hypothetical renaming of the Communist Party back in the 1990s would have affected the party's support significantly? I mean, to what extent the Communist Party's support has been linked with the actual program of the party? To what extent with so-called communist nostalgia, and to what extent with the general opposition to the post-1989 system? In other words, how important has been the communist adjective for the party?
Thank you for the question. So I think it's worth saying that at one level, we might argue that, what's in a name? Does it make much of a difference? I would suggest that it makes some difference, but maybe not as great a difference as we might suggest. What's important about the name, in a way, is it sends a signal. It sends a signal out to voters. It sends a signal that there isn't such a sharp break, a desire to distance so strongly from the past by keeping the word communist in the title. That matters precisely for one of the things that you alluded to, that kind of nostalgia to the communist period, which is important for some citizens. I mentioned the work of Popeliches and Tucker, and their work about kind of attitudes that kind of inculcated some of those views on issues to do with, for example, the role of the economy, the role of the state in the economy, and about issues to do with distribution and economic equality. And so it's certainly true that by holding on to the name, that's important for capturing that kind of nostalgia vote. But ultimately, yes, what really matters is not so much the name per se. It's about the program of the party, and the fact that this party, unlike the Polish case or unlike the Czech case, and unlike the policies pursued by SDL, for example, in the 1990s, didn't distance itself as far away from the past, and was much more critical of processes of privatization, for example, and that transformation of the economy in the 1990s.
Okay, thank you. We have the first questions on our YouTube chat. It's by our colleague at the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regime, Wojciech Rybka. Thanks for the points raised and their comprehensibility. Could you please develop more on the darker of the legacy shadow? Legacy/shadow.
Mm-hmm. So what I would say here is one of the important points about kind of attitudinal change. Let me make a very a simple point, but a very important point. And again, I think this comes out nicely in Popeliches and Tucker's work. it takes a long time for attitudes to change. It takes a long time for attitudes towards democracy. The key kind of aspects of democracy toward attitudes like self-limitation, like reciprocity, like understanding of feedback. It takes a long time and experience of democratic processes in order to inculcate those into politicians. That becomes into citizens. It becomes much harder for those who have been schooled and have formed their views, formed their attitudes during communist times. So it's not, one of the more interesting things is that those attitudes towards communism, those attitudes towards many of the aspects of that state, that even with 3 decades of change, but for those generations, there's still a significant, significant proportion of the electorate, proportion of the citizens of both the Czech and Slovak republics who are not kind of fully signed up to the benefits, if you like, of democracy, and look back with more nostalgic views towards the communist past. Thank you for the question.
Yeah. Okay. I guess you have already answered the second question by Wojciech Rybka. What do you mean by darker? Darker compared to what? Whose expectations?
So, a range of expectations. So one of the things that I would say is if we go back to 1989, 1990, if you look at some of the literature at that time, a lot of it was emphasizing how difficult it was going to be to actually transform these societies after 4 decades of a harsh, brutal regime that aimed at transformation. And at that time, many scholars, politicians, and others didn't really necessarily expect that 3 decades on, these countries would be democratic. So there was a lot of expectation that the shadow would indeed be darker would indeed be dark. In the title, I did use the question marks, or a classic tool for an academic to allow himself or herself to argue both ways. Actually, I would suggest to you that it's not as dark as many people expected. I think that if we look at both the Czech and the Slovak cases 3 decades on, we might suggest that the glass is not necessarily full, but the glass is at least half full. Some might suggest it's half empty, but it's half full. And that's maybe a lot better than many people were expecting back in 1989, 1990.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask the second question. What would have been the result of the Communist Party of Bohemia and Moravia renaming? If the renamed party had survived as a parliamentary subject. Do you think, Tim, that the Czech party system, as well as the politics in general, would have turned a different direction?
Good question. Hypothetical questions are always tough to answer, but I think they're always interesting ones to pose. So an interesting reflection. So one of the things that I think is important about KSČ is this is a party, as that graph that I showed, Lukáš Linek's stuff article back in 2008, and some of his subsequent work demonstrates this quite nicely. It's a party that has a relatively solid kind of support base, and it's able to pull in a significant number of voters into supporting the party, albeit this is a declining section of Czech society because biology catches up with everyone in the end. But what's interesting about that is to say, well, what would have happened if they'd have taken a more kind of expansive approach, as you were kind of suggesting? Would we have seen a similar kind of development that we saw, for example, in the Hungarian and the Polish cases? I think the Slovak case is complicated partly because of the minorities, the issue of the politics of independence and post-federal politics, which I mentioned. But I think, you know, it's a fair guess to assume that we might well have seen a similar kind of development as we saw in, say, Poland and in Hungary. Of course, if they had followed that path, to go back to the work of Anna Křimová-Busa, for example, the danger then of projecting yourself as essentially more of a managerial, having more of a kind of managerial pitch to the electorate, is what happens when you don't manage things particularly well. What happens when you're affected by a corruption scandal? You know, Gyurcsány in Hungary, as soon as that recording came out that he lied in the morning, noon and night, that really hit MSP's support in Hungary really hard. Or we think about the Ruingate scandals and others that hit SLD in Poland very hard, and they have never really been able to recover from that. So one of the dangers here is, if you like, to draw on the literature that Noam Lupu has used, for example, his writings about Latin America. He talks about a party brand. And one of the problems is, you know, a party has a brand, it stands for something. The problem is if it moves away from that party brand and becomes purely, its pitch becomes purely development dependent, contingent on its ability to deliver the goods, to be good managerially, then as soon as things turn south in terms of economics or corruption or whatever, it hits you really, really hard. So in some senses, maybe, you know, the strategy for KSČ wasn't such a crazy strategy all along. It's a party that has endured in party systems and in a country where several parties have not endured. But of course, it's endured, but it's not been in a position of power. It's not been in a position of being able to really affect in a significant way politics in at the national level in the Czech Republic. Sorry, it's just quite a long answer, but hopefully helpful.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm gonna ask the third and probably the final question. In your lecture, you have asked a hypothetical question: what does really matter in 2021 these days? Let me ask the same question in the opposite way. What is not important for the most people in the Czech Republic and Slovakia anymore regarding the communist past? Do you think, for example, that the lustration laws have become something that the Czech society sees as something obsolete or even useless?
So I think it's a really interesting question to kind of reflect on. I think with the really important caveat about kind of the generation, I know I've mentioned that a few times already, but important to stress, a certain cohort of people who lived through and were negatively affected in a very significant way, not being able to have the careers that they wanted, they're having suffered severe kind of repression. Those kinds of individuals in that particular cohort, the communist past still matters in a negative way, and seeing a strong desire for justice, which was at the driving force of that very harsh lustration set of rules in Czechoslovakia in the early 1990s. That I think still matters for that kind of portion of the Czech electorate. What I would say though is what doesn't seem to matter, and this is a sweeping generalization, but I think this is really true, is that for younger generations, you know, when I talk to young Czechs and Slovaks, they're usually, they think that topics to do with communism are often topics to do with their parents or their grandparents. They're not so concerned about what happened back in the kind of, what for them might feel like a kind of ancient past. So for many of those, you know, the issue of many of the younger generation, lustration is not an important important issue. You know, what Andrej Babiš may or may not have done, what Agent Bureš may or may not have done in the 1980s is of far, far less importance to young Czechs than the fact that European funds may or may not have been funneled to Agrofert to build the Stork's Nest and for other things like that. That's what really matters. The issues of governance and the quality of governance, these are the things that seem to matter much more to the younger cohorts of voters. So maybe, you know, perhaps one of the key arguments I've tried to make, maybe it could have made it even clearer, is that really the legacy, the shadow of communism is hugely dependent on the cohort, the generational cohort which you're looking at. That has affected attitudes and views, not just of the communist past, but of the post 89 period as well.
Thank you, Mr. Haughton. It's been a great privilege for us to have you at the conference, although it's held online, unfortunately. Well, let me thank you, and I'm gonna remind that the conference is not over. We have the last, the sixth panel, which begins at 3:15 p.m. in about 45 minutes.